Alrighty, everybody. Let's talk about a game I played recently, and it's going to highlight a point that I want to talk about at the end. I'm probably going to slow down a little bit how many chess videos I make. I just need to kind of refocus a little bit, and I have been playing unfocused. So my games lately, I've just been kind of playing, just kind of going through the motions, and I want to just kind of maybe pull back from making the videos so it doesn't feel like I have to make videos or I don't have to play chess. I'm playing chess because I want to. We'll talk about that at the end. But anyway, right now let's quickly talk about this game. So my opponent played a d4, and this gave me a chance to try out the Slav line I was hoping to get into. Unfortunately, my opponent continued with a different moveset now. He didn't go for a Queen's Gambit line. So since my opponent didn't go for a Queen's Gambit line, the Slav line is no longer an active move. In fact, let's look at the database. Yeah, knight f6 and e6 are the two most common responses, where the knight f6 is, the most common by far. Notice this does come with an attack on my undefended pawn, so I do need to defend that pawn. The c6 pawn push is the third most common, and it's what I went for. So this is the Slav structure that I was trying to set up so that eventually we could push this b pawn, almost making a sacrifice with my b pawn in order to drive this knight into a really bad spot. So I'm going to give up this pawn, not really give it up, but essentially give up this pawn to trade away this knight. So I'm going to have a bad b pawn, and he's going to have a bad knight, and hopefully that translates into a good knight for me. No. So that's what the Slav is looking to do. The Slav is looking to use the advantage of this b pawn to drive this knight into becoming useless, which, if you look at it as a straight trade, that's a happy trade for black. My opponent continued. I'm not familiar with this move at all. I don't know what this pawn structure is trying to do. My guess is they are looking to try to challenge the center, right? Strengthen up this center. And at this point in time, I should have made a mental note that my opponent was using his kingside pawns already, which means my opponent's probably looking at castling queenside. I did not consider that at this time, but later on in the game we'll see what my opponent actually does. But I should have taken this as an early indicator that, yes, my opponent still can castle kingside, but it's also possible they're looking to castle queenside. And that thought never crossed my mind. So I just continue my standard developing moves. This is also the Slavic response order. My opponent pinned, and I've got a couple options. Number one, I can push h6 to try to drive this bishop somewhere else. He still has a nice hidey hole, and that f-pawn has given him full access to a hidey hole already. So that's one thing I'm looking at. The other is, do I continue with a pawn push maybe, and then get my... Notice I can push this pawn, and my queen still defends, so I don't have to mess up my kingside pawns. I can defend with the bishop eventually. So the question that I now have is, do I push this pawn? So looking back at my notes, eventually in the Slavic game, e6 is coming. The idea is e6 is coming to eventually support bishop to b4 to put pressure along this diagonal. Even consider making a trade here to mess up the pawns over here, especially if my opponent is looking to castle queenside. That would have been a nice trade to do. The other thing it does is, remember, if this knight is no longer here and this knight is pushed back, my c pawn is already advanced. My b pawn is already advanced. So my b pawn eventually could come up here with support, right? So my b pawn would be supported by my bishop, and maybe perhaps my c pawn jumps in, and then we get an exchange here. My bishop to b4 could support my overextended b pawn. That's an option that could happen down the road, but that's neither here nor there. So in this game, I decided to go ahead and use that, right? I'm supporting my central pawn. I have opened up my dark square bishop, so it's okay. And then the question is, where do we park it? Do we park it here or somewhere else? Now my opponent's trying to develop his knight. Notice he has blocked off two of the paths for him to travel to get out into the game, which is one of the reasons why pushing this f-pawn so early is kind of a weakness, because again, if you're trying to castle kingside, now you're stuck putting this knight on the edge, which is not the strongest square for this knight. You'd rather have it here or here, where it has a little bit more range. So when I saw this knight, the question is, where can the knight go from here? Well, the knight can come back to f2, or it can come to f4. Those are really all the places that that knight can go. So now, developing my dark square bishop, I said, let's put it here and control the, do a little bit more control over the f4 square. So this knight is probably not going to end up here. Now, if it does, right, we could make a quick trade. It's not the end of the world. But more importantly, if my opponent were to trade here, that knight would, sitting on f4 would become undefended. So now that's my goal real quick. So I have an intermediate goal. Keep pressure on this, keep control of this f4 square, and maybe possibly remove the defender of that f4 square. My opponent brought his queen out, which is fine, and now it's pretty obvious my opponent's going to be castling queenside. Removing the defender of the f4 square, my opponent simply steps into the f4 square and says, are we trading? But now he's got additional coverage on that square. So now what? And that's kind of where I left it, is now what? I'm not 100% certain. I have my d6 covered, so if my opponent were to make a trade, I could then bring my queen out, and my queen has a little bit of influence along that diagonal. Now, obviously, my opponent's queen also has it covered, but it is something that I briefly entertain. I can't make a decision right away, so I said, you know what, I'm already prepared to castle. I'm going to go ahead and castle. I'm pretty sure my opponent's going to queenside castle, and which means I've got all my pawns and all my pieces over here that still need to be developed. Look how far behind in development I am now, right? So this is kind of what I'm talking about going on autopilot. I'm reacting to what my opponent's doing, but I'm not really following any opening principles. So I've got to get these guys out somewhere. And notice my queenside knight is a bit trapped in. If I bring my queenside knight to d7, my light square bishop is trapped in. So my queenside knight is a bit blah. So how do we get my queenside knight out? Well, my opponent continues his expansion in the center. And this is where I get my bright idea. Now, something that I'm hoping everybody pause your videos and figure out what I missed. What does black need to be doing right at this second? And what tactic is available to white that black is not seeing? So, pause, figure it out, and come back. Are you back? Did you spot it? Because if you said that this is a fork, you're 100% correct. This is a very, very basic fork that is at the very beginning of every tactics book that discusses forks. This is very common structure to see a bishop and a knight spaced out, a pawn chain, in this case a doubly protected pawn chain, but just a simple pawn chain is all it takes to fork one of these pieces. You can't save both. So if my opponent pushes his pawn, if the e pawn comes to e5, I can't save both my pieces. So either I take with my bishop, my opponent brings his other pawn to capture, and then I have to save my knight. I mean, something like that. That's all we're doing. Or I have to throw away my knight somewhere to maybe put pressure. Yeah, maybe something like this. Put pressure here, so my opponent has to respond to that first. So maybe they capture here, and then I can retreat my bishop somewhere, right? So this is a very textbook fork that I 100% miss. I had gotten focused on getting my queenside knight out, and notice pushing this pawn. If my opponent takes, that's fine. I can take back. I'm 100% happy. Or I can just bring my knight into the game. And my opponent executes his plan. I said some very choice curse words at my ignorance for 100% missing this. This is a very basic fork that we have to know. And I am trying to play games where I protect my bishops. So in this case, I was going to defend my bishop. So either I retreat my bishop or I execute my plan. I attack the queen, so my opponent has to respond to the knight first. My opponent captures the knight, and then I retreat my bishop. So I am now down an entire piece from this moment on. A couple more trades in the center. I now have a decent center. I'm kind of happy with. My opponent also has a decent center. So there are some things. My pawn is defended. If my opponent pushes his e-pawn down, it is also defended. But I have got to get developed here. So my opponent castles queenside. Finally, I'm starting to get developed. Notice there is a little bit of pressure on this pawn. I've got 2 attackers on it. My opponent only has 1 defender. So my opponent, correct move, gets an overly defended. I do not really have a good way of getting an extra attacker on this pawn. Notice, notice my queen can't quite get into the action, and if my queen were to drive up here, a simple pawn push would stop it from getting along this. So that just takes a little, and plus my opponent actually has it, looking at it now, I didn't even see this in the game. My opponent actually has it defended. I have it attacked twice, they have it defended once, twice, 3 times. Now, granted, previously, the material imbalance would have been such that they would not have wanted to trade away a queen just to pick up my knight and my pawn, but you get the point. The point is now, even if I bring in more heavy hitters on that pawn, it's not going to be worth it. So I make one exchange just to try to eliminate my opponent's bishop. So I am down in material. I do not want to be exchanging. However, removing my opponent's bishop, my opponent also has the bishop pair, that becomes a good strategy for me anyway. That was my thought process. So yes, this is an even trade, right? We both traded a pawn and a piece, but I got my opponent's bishop. So I now have a pair of bishops. My opponent only has 1 bishop. He has an extra knight. So there is that. So I'm still down in material, but I've gotten a tiny bit of confidence back. Not confidence. I feel like I've got a little bit of something back. Time to develop, right? I am behind in my development, so I've got to get developed. The question was, where do I want my bishop to go? And my thought process was, my bishop is going to be pretty much, if I put it here to add protection to my pawn, which would be a good thing, because right now that pawn is only defended by my queen, and notice my opponent has attacked once, twice, 3 times, so I only have 1 defender here. So if I get my other bishop here to, say, the e6 square, I can get an extra defender on it. Yes, technically it's still not defended enough, but at least it would get another defender in there. Or I can reroute my bishop back here to assume this pawn is gone, assume I'm going to lose that pawn, get my bishop here defended by my f-pawn, and keep a strong diagonal. So I have 2 strong diagonals. If I use my bishop as a defender of this pawn, I'm probably going to end up losing that bishop. So if I want to keep my bishop, I can reroute it here, which is what I did. My opponent, that pawn is defended, so my opponent is attacking my bishop, but I knew he was coming back here anyway. My opponent adds another attacker to this pawn, so that pawn is dead. I cannot save that pawn. So now I start expanding on the queen side. We're going to get attackers on the queen side. I need to get my bishop underneath so that I could push this up. And lo and behold, what have we done? Let's go back here. So here, let's pause again for another tactic. What do I have problems with? What does black have problems with right now? And this is another thing that I've talked about many times, both as an attacker and as a defender. I have alignment issues. So let's say, for example, this queen were to move somewhere else. Oops. Close this. Now I've got my pawn defended. If this queen were to, say, go somewhere over here, then I have a major alignment issue. So this is another place where I 100% missed. So my thought process at the time was, the defender of the bishop is this queen. If I can shift the queen over, then I can pick up a free piece. Duh, no you can't, because that rook is sitting there. Duh, no you can't, because that knight is sitting there. So now I'm 100% on autopilot thinking I'll make another trade, giving up my bishop in order to get my opponent's bishop. So I'm thinking trade here, and then I get my piece back, the piece that I'm still down this whole time. Of course not. So now I've made more trades, which is in my opponent's favor, and now look. Worst case scenario, the absolute worst case scenario, my opponent has an attack, which comes with check, I'm forced to respond to, and I drop a whole queen. Don't even notice it. Don't even notice it. I had all that time to see it. I never even noticed it. My opponent makes the smart decision, captures my queen. Now, at this point in time, there is another alignment issue that I notice. So I'm gonna at least try to get my material back, but I can't because my rook is pinned. So in my haste to try to, in my frustration that I fell into the same trap that I have been talking about for weeks, I do the same thing myself. So I fall into it, and then I get pissed, and I don't actually do the proper movement sequence. However, my opponent misses it. So I am down. But before my opponent moves this knight, let's look at the material on the board. I have 2 rooks. My opponent has 1 rook and a queen and a knight. So if we even out the material, right, those 2 rooks balance out. I have a rook versus my opponent's queen and knight. I am way down. And that's not even mentioning that my opponent has an extra passed pawn, right? 4 pawns. 4 pawns. Here's a free passed pawn my opponent has. So a queen, a knight, and a passed pawn for my rook. I'm way down in material. And unfortunately, my opponent misses it. So I'm back in the game, even though I played like shit. So I'm still not happy at this point in time. Clockwise, we're about even. I've got, 30, 40 seconds on my opponent. That's not a massive difference. It's going to become more and more of a problem as the clock winds down. But now I'm up in material. Well, actually, I shouldn't say up. I have 10 points of material. My opponent has 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So technically, yeah, we're even in material, but it's a slight imbalance, right? For a rook, those guys cancel out. I have a rook, and my opponent has a knight and 2 pawns. Now, technically, this pawn is about to fall, so I'm going to get a little bit of material back, but it's still going to be tight, right? So I've got a rook behind a passed pawn. My opponent cannot get over here in time to defend it. It would take them, there's really no path to get him in to get around to save it. The best he could hope for will be here to here, but by then that's too late. So I quickly gobble that up before my opponent can get into position. And now I'm technically up, but just barely. This knight is undefended. My opponent defends it, and then I double up rooks. So now I've got some serious attackers here. My opponent does not have time to get another defender. Notice again, it would take 1, 2 moves to get it in place, and so now I'm going to go up material. I'm exposed, so my opponent will have now a free move to get, which they don't take there, which they should have, unfortunately. They should have gotten a free check here to force me out to bring his rook down to get another defender along this line. That would have been the correct move order. In fact, let's back this up, yeah. this would have been the correct move. Would have put me in check. I have to hide, and then he can drop down, put a defender on this. Because now he's got 2 defenders, and I have 2 attackers. And am I really going to trade both of my rooks for one of his rooks and one of his bishop and one of his pawns? Nah. Nah. I am not ready to give up my advantage yet. So, back to the game at hand. Now my opponent is down in time significantly. There's a 2-minute time imbalance right at the end of the game. My opponent's running out of time. So, on paper right now, it looks like I'm about to win this game, even though I should be down almost a whole queen or more. Yeah, so now my opponent's finally defending this pawn. I'm just getting my rooks around behind. My opponent finally puts that check in. He centralizes his rook, which is fine. Unfortunately, I think, like I said, at this point in time, it's just too little too late. He just doesn't have the time to make good decisions. So I just throw in some checks just to drive my opponent, force my opponent to make decisions, keeping my rook along the back rank. Pick up an extra pawn. Now this rook is defended, so we've barricaded here. I can now roam with my other rook, but my opponent just doesn't have time, so I have a passed pawn. I can just keep pushing it. At this point, my opponent should run his rook behind it, would be the smart decision, but he just runs out of time. So, yeah, it's just one of those things that it happened, right? This happened. This is not the way I wanted to win this game. I happened to win it. But I mean, let's go back and look at the game. We just talked about it, right? Like, this was not a good showing from the black pieces. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that I'm going on autopilot sometimes. I think that, I'm playing games, and I don't want to say that I'm getting cocky. I don't want to say that, but it's possible. It's possible that I'm secure in my chess knowledge, and like I'm shouting from the rooftops, like, look how good I am. Like, I used to suck at chess, like majorly. I barely understood how pieces moved, right? And now, like, within 6 months to a year, I'm at a 1400 rating, which is pretty damn good, right? Like, it's not fantastic, but it's, middle of the pack of serious chess players, right? So it's like, oh, okay, like, hey, I can do this. I can play this game and have fun doing it. But I'm not having the fun anymore because I'm making bad moves, right? I'm making poor decisions, and even though my rating continues to climb, which I'm super excited about, it's coming at the expense of bad chess. Now, that's possible that it's because that I am trying to learn new openings, and I'm trying to learn new things, and I make mistakes while I'm learning because, you can't memorize every single possibility. Your opponents are not going to play the way you expect them to. So it's entirely possible that my trying to learn things, and just like this game, right? Just like in this particular game, I tried to force the Slav defense, even though it technically wasn't a Slav defense. I made mistakes because of it. So it's possible that the process of learning these openings is causing me to play bad, make mistakes because I'm thinking about other things, or I'm allowing myself to be distracted by things that are happening, outside of the game, or I've, got the TV on, so I'm watching TV instead of actually paying attention to the game. But it's possible that me trying to learn these new openings, I'm going to make mistakes. And then at the end of the game, I just run on once we get well outside of book moves and book theory, and I start dropping material, then I have to turn on my focus and start paying attention again and try to scramble out of it. Maybe that's what's happening. So psychologically, maybe there's something there that I'm getting cocky, I'm not paying attention, I'm trying new move sets, and then when the shit hits the fan and I have to put my brain back in gear and say, okay, I got to take this game seriously, I'm able to, basically use some luck, right? Use the little bit of skills that I've developed take advantage of any opportunities my opponents give and hold games to a draw or squeeze out a win on time or squeeze out a win because my opponent made one big mistake at a crucial point. So it's possible like that's what's happening. But either way, I think I'm probably going to slow down a little bit on my chess recordings. Maybe instead of trying to get 2 games a day, maybe I'll just go back to just maybe 1 game a day, or maybe just 1 game every other day, and just kind of make sure that I'm playing the games because it's a game, you know, and I want to play the games because I enjoy it, not because I feel like I'm getting mad at myself and blah blah blah. And I'm not playing good chess. Yes, these are first world problems. I get it. It's chess. It's a fun game. But I want to make sure that I'm playing the games because that the whole reason I started this whole series was so that we all can just play fun chess. And so as we continue to play fun chess, we got to make sure that that fun is in there, right? That we're having a good time. It's still a game. I'm not taking it so seriously that I'm going to go out and to try to compete in tournaments and crap like that, and it's not a job to me. This is not a job. This is just something I'm just doing for fun, and I have to remember that. And maybe slowing things down a little bit and just having some fun where the fun is. So I'm going to try that for a little bit, see if that helps. I'm not giving up. I'm still going to keep playing. I've got some fun openings that we've learned, and we need to go back to our principles and just play our opening principles and just stick to that. So, alrighty guys, I hope you guys are still having fun. I still hope you're still enjoying your games, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.